Welcome to the Vision by Protiviti interview. I'm Joe Kornik, Editor-in-Chief of Vision by Protiviti, our global content resource examining big themes that will impact the C-suite and executive boardrooms worldwide. Today, we're exploring the future of money, and I'm thrilled to have David Cowen, the President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, join me today. David is going to walk us through a brief history of money in the United States, or what would become the United States, way before we even had the US dollar. The museum has amazing historical collections from those days, and David will be sharing those in just a moment. The Museum of American Finance, by the way, was a big source of historical reference for Lin-Manuel Miranda when he was writing Hamilton. Following David's presentation, I'm going to ask him a few questions about a very uncertain financial future. So David, thank you so much for being here, and let me turn it over to you to begin.
Joe, what a pleasure to be back here with our friends at Protiviti. And we're going to be talking a little bit about money, as you know. And as the museum, if you don't know where you've been, how do you know where you're going? So we want to turn the clock back just a little bit to set the stage for a flavor of what money was at the beginning of our country, trace it very quickly to today, and then maybe we'll do that little Q&A you mentioned about. So the first thing to talk about is it's the Revolutionary War. We're not a country yet. We're under the Articles of Confederation. The 13 states are banded together. And take a look at this note. And by the way, all of these are from the museum's collection. We have literally thousands of documents. This is paper, this is money, and it's dated the 10th of May, 1775. This is the first day of the Second Continental Congress. The fighting started a few weeks earlier, April 19th, Lexington and Concord. But what does your Continental Congress do? On the very first day, they turn on the printing presses. And this is very elaborate. Let's take a quick look at this. It's got some marbling, which is attributed to Ben Franklin, who was a printer, of course, and it's anti-counterfeiting. And there's always these Latin words of encouragement. This one means energy. And then this is in Spanish, mil dollars. So we don't even have a US dollar at this point, but you could potentially turn this in for some Spanish coins. By the way, foreign coins are going to be legal tender in the United States until 1857. It's not until those gold rushes where we get enough of a domestic source of gold and then eventually silver that we have our own currency backed by our own gold and silver. And on the back, it's quite elaborate. I kind of like this where it anticipates the fighting. That's Latin for homes will cease to be quiet. But it's not just the Continental Congress that's issuing money. This is a note from Georgia. And in Georgia, you could take a look here that it's backed not by gold or silver or something like that, silver in the case of the Continental, but by money arising from the grabbing of estates that were loyal to the crown. You need to have something backing your currency. Well, that's all well and good, but unfortunately, we lose Savannah. And so what was backing this currency isn't going to be there. So it's states as well as our nation, which is issuing currency. The problem with this is there's hyperinflation at that time. It's not just Germany. When I went to school, we learned about the textbooks and the wheelbarrows worth of money to buy a loaf of bread. It's happening right here in the United States. And that continental currency I showed you is going to depreciate and settle it like a penny or 2 penny on the dollars, giving Americans a terrible aversion to paper money. And by the way, this inflation's so bad, George Washington writes a letter in the middle of the war saying a wagonful worth of money won't buy a wagonful worth of provisions. So who is going to straighten all of this out? Well, we become a nation officially April 30th, 1789. George Washington takes the oath of office in New York City. And then he brings on Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of the Treasury. He'll be in office for 6 years. He's going to write 3 monumental state papers. He's going to write others, but let's focus on 3 real quickly. The first is the report on public credit. That is going to straighten out and untangle all the leftover debt from the Revolutionary War. It's the first great bailout because we're going to assume not just the Continental Congress's debt, but all the state debt and reissue new U.S. debt, U.S. securities, of which there is a direct line to today's national debt. The second one is to create a quasi-central bank, a central regulating monetary authority, And that is accomplished for 20 years. And the third is to establish the US dollar. And at that time, set it against certain levels of gold and silver. All of these have to get through Congress. Some of them have big fights. The room where it happened, a rap from the musical Hamilton, is about that whole assumption of the debts, but they all do pass. But because we have this aversion to government issued paper at the time, who's issuing it? Most people don't realize the banks initially, from the start of our country all the way through the Depression, and then the government will get back involved a little bit later during the Civil War. But initially, it's the banks that are issuing the currency. And we have several notes here, a $1, a $2, and a $3 from the Bank of New York, which, by the way, today is still in existence as BNY Mellon. But you can see that it was individual banks throughout the country issuing. Now, that was fine if you were in New York with your note, but what if you were traveling outside of New York to Philly or Charleston? These notes would depreciate and there'd be registers and books, and they'd also be counterfeited. Very messy situation because you wouldn't get a full dollar on a dollar if you were in another town. The next one, though, shows you that that first Bank of the United States, by the way, in its day called the Bank of the United States, but looking back because there was a second Bank of the United States, a second quasi-central bank, issued notes as well. And this was the main circulating medium because it had branches, 8 of them eventually throughout the country. And so you could bring notes of that bank and they wouldn't necessarily be depreciated if you brought a Boston note, let's say, to New York or to Philadelphia. But that was also a government owned only 20%, 80% by the public. So again, a quasi bank that acted as a central bank. So moving forward quickly to currency in the Civil War, this is where the government gets back into the business of printing currency. And if you see the back, it's all green, and that's where the phrase greenbacks come from. Now, this particular note was not backed gold or silver, but you're going to see quickly that we do get back on a gold standard. But for the issues and problems of the war, we have to get off gold. Here is the bank from Kansas issuing a $2 note. This is called a lazy deuce because the $2 on its side. All the banks could still issue after the Civil War, but they had to hold 90% reserves at the Treasury Department. Moving along. So when the government also starts issuing, you can get gold back or silver back notes. And so here's an example where you could go back to the Treasury. Gold and silver are set at certain amounts, and you could turn your note in for specific amounts of gold or silver. But that's going to all change once the Depression hits. Now, remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes into office. The Great Depression's in full swing. There's the initial bank holiday. Most people don't realize the banks, all of them, closed for 100 days. There was a lack of money around, very difficult time, but there were so many bank failures that it was an extreme measure that was taken. The second extreme measure most people don't realize is all your gold was confiscated. This is for individuals. You would have to line up then and turn your gold into the Treasury because if you didn't, there were very severe fines for that. By the way, this is going to be rescinded in the mid-70s under the Ford administration, and that's why we all now can own gold. The other thing to know about, though, is that the banks now are stopped out. They can't issue their own currency. It's all going to be by the government. One other thing to note was there were high denomination bills back then. These are $500 and $1,000 bills. These were all stopped, in particular because of the black market, the drug trade, to make it much harder to move cash around. And so that's your whirlwind tour, Joe, of how we get to today and our current currency. And I'm happy to field your questions now about any of these topics.
Thanks, David, for that walk through historical America and the origins of money and the origins of the US dollar and the Treasury. Fascinating stuff. And I know the museum does great work and has all kind of great information, a lot more than even what you shared here with us on that presentation.
Yeah, Joe, that was one of the quickest, if not the quickest tour of our currency that I've ever done. So
yeah, I've seen you do it, and it's much longer. But I appreciate you scaling it back for us here, David. I just wanted to ask you. I mean, you talked about the past. I wanted to sort of push us forward a little bit and talk about the future. But first, I'd like to just know what do you think Alexander Hamilton would think of the state of our national debt right now?
So Hamilton, as we mentioned, he created this national debt. And he actually said the phrase, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be a national blessing. By the way, his detractors often take out that middle line, if it is not excessive, just to blame him for the debt. Uh, but in my opinion, he'd be spinning in his grave at this massive 33 odd trillion dollars worth of debt.
Right. And what about the deficits that we've sort of grown accustomed to, right? I mean, this is the highest ever outside of wartime that we're running right now. What do you think the founding fathers would think about that?
So let's contextualize a little about how much this really is. If we could bring up our debt clock, and you can see that we're currently at some 33 odd trillion dollars worth of debt, closing in on $100,000 per citizen, and 258,000 per taxpayer. This is an incredible load of debt. And so the question is really, though, okay, can we service this debt? What are the ways to lower this debt? We're at really extreme levels, 120% roughly, it says 123% of the federal debt. So there's several ways. The least appealing, of course, and the one we don't want to talk about, is you could default on the debt, right? That's a disaster and just a horrible scenario. You can raise taxes, right? That's one way to get it down, but that's a political hot potato. You can lower spending, equally a political hot potato, or the ideal one is to potentially grow your way out of it. And so that is the preferred scenario, that maybe we get the economy cooking or chugging along at such a great pace that we're able to help do that. The problem now is we're in a rising interest rate environment, the highest level since roughly 2007. And so when debt becomes, the nation's debt becomes due, we're refunding it, refinancing it at a much higher level. We were at 1.5%, and now we're closing in on, 4.75, 5%. And that spells trouble down the road.
Right. And I should mention, I mean, we're recording this in early October 2023. By the time some folks watch this, that debt, unfortunately, will be higher. Not most likely, it will not be going down. It'll only be getting larger.
Joe, right. What we've witnessed in Washington lately is not a forum for getting together on ideas and moving forward.
Right. So, David, how concerned should we be? I mean, that could potentially, you mentioned default, which, I mean, how concerned should we be about the downgrading of the U.S. credit rating? Because we've seen that a few times.
We have, most recently by Fitch, but they were just catching up to a dozen years ago when S&P made the original downgrade, and Fitch cited the two concerns you and I just talked about. They said governance, and then they also said the rising interest rate environment. And at the level it is, it's still AA plus or roughly, but it is scary if we start to go through more downgrades. But everything's relative, and therefore, what are your other options? By the way, the states are also awash in debt. They are equally profligate in what they have issued. Some states a little better than others. As far as just saying, though, default, just because we were mentioning it, most people don't realize that states have defaulted in our nation's history. In the 1840s, several states with a bad economy defaulted. We certainly know municipalities and cities have. The United States, though, never has, right? Never missed an interest payment, hasn't done that. And we certainly pray that that never happens.
David, what impact do you think the things that you've been discussing, right, debt, deficits, and credit ratings, could have on the future of the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency? And sort of where do things stand? And what could theoretically happen if the dollar does lose some of its dominance?
So let's take a little bit of the last part first, in a sense that some people will say, "Oh, the U.S. dollar has lost some of its preeminence. It's been devalued." Why? Well, if you take a look from Alexander Hamilton's day, $1 is worth $20 of gold. Now $1, it's $1,800 worth of gold. So you've had a 90 times devaluation. People like Jim Grant of Jim Grant's Interest Rate Observer say, hey, back in 1933, when we went off the gold standard, that's actually a default. But to really dig into this, you've got to say, are there other relative options? And certainly nations that aren't friendly to us would certainly like to replace the dollar. But remember, it's so intertwined also with the international banking system and free capital flows. And if you look at what potentially could replace it, the Chinese renminbi, they don't have free capital flows. Are you going to get involved with a country like that? Crypto has all sorts of its own problems. Gold, as we know, is just not elastic enough for this type of modern economy. So while there are all sorts of pressures on the US dollar, I don't see a viable alternative in the near future here.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm sure that our business leaders who are watching this will be happy to know that, because certainly they are rooting for stability and not chaos in global monetary systems. So David, we've looked back, you've taken us back a few hundred years today, and we appreciate that. But I'd like to look forward. I won't ask you to go out 200 years, but how about a decade or even a little further? Any thoughts on where we'll be as a country, as a financial system in the year 2035 or maybe even 2040? Any thoughts?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball other than a look at history. And so the British, the pound, was supreme for about 150 years with an inflection point roughly around World War I or so. And so if we use that as our guide and you add 150 years-ish onto the US dollar, what does that give us? Roughly, another 30, 40 years or so of US dollar. So my best guess, and that's all it is that old Mark Twain quote that the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. And so let's all hope that's the case for several decades to come.
David, thank you so much for that look back and that look forward. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Fascinating stuff.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for watching the Vision by Protiviti interview. For David Cowen, I'm Joe Kornik. We'll see you next time.